Okay, so welcome everybody. So my name is Keith. I've been a project manager for WITIC for about 7 years now. I'm here with my colleague Paul Buckoll, and today we'll be talking about the Stage 13 amendments to the BC CSR and its impact on property transactions, development, and management. There's a lot of people on the call, so I'd just like to remind everybody to mute themselves during the presentation. During the presentation, I also encourage you to use the chat box. We will get to the questions at the end of the presentation. And then, we'll also have some time for open discussion at the end of the presentation. It's about a 15-minute presentation followed by Q&A. We'll get going here.
All right. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Paul. I'm a project manager with WITIC Environmental. And I'm here to talk to you today about the Stage 13 amendments to the BC Contaminated Sites Regulations, or BC CSR. So the purpose of these changes is to bring specific sites to the Ministry of Environment's attention and to ensure investigation and remediation of these potentially contaminated sites occurs prior to the redevelopment of the property. So this only applies to sites with specific commercial and industrial activities. These activities are known as Schedule 2 activities, and I'll define maybe what the ministry classifies these as and how they classify these in a couple slides here. This process is initiated when the activity stops or ceases operations, or when the property is being redeveloped, as there are some municipal permits and hurdles that need to be taken care of at this point in time. So these can be held, and you can kind of be forced through this investigation pathway at this point in time, and the ministry has some control over it. Sale of the property can also trigger some of this documentation, but just not the investigation remediation process. So we'll touch on more on that a little bit as well. So the site profile form, some of you may be familiar with, that's the old. Now we're in with the new, which is the site disclosure statement. It's being replacing the site profile. The major differences between these two forms are there's no more long questionnaire. So if you've ever filled out a site profile, you've definitely gone through this. There's quite a number of yes or no answers. You have to, yes or no questions that you have to answer. And then with this new form, basically it's just, do you have or have you had a Schedule 2 activity on your property? Yes or no. There's a little bit of room to add some text or discussion below that, but it's pretty black and white at this point in time. It's have you or do you have a Schedule 2 activity, or no? And if it's a yes, then we'll let you know what happens then. So I've been talking a lot about Schedule 2 activities, and some of you may not have heard this term before. The Ministry of Environment classifies a Schedule 2 activity as something that has the potential to contaminate the subsurface of a property. So most people are familiar with things like auto repairs, gas stations, maybe dry cleaners, things like that are pretty prevalent in the Victoria area. But there's almost 100 activities listed on this Schedule 2 list. Most of them are more heavy industrial manufacturing type activities that you're not going to come across on a day-to-day basis. But there is quite an extensive list here, and any of these activities being listed on your property, either currently or historically, will force you to answer yes on this SDS, or site disclosure statement. So significant additions or removals from the Schedule 2 as far as these updates go is that spills, including residential properties, have been added to Schedule 2 of the CSR. So that means if you have had or do have in the future a spill that's large enough to be recorded and reported to the Ministry of Environment, it's now considered to be a Schedule 2 activity on the property. And you have to check yes on that SDS form. Sandblasting has also been added, as well as shipping and handling has been added to the end of a bunch of activities. So previously where you had to actually do the manufacturing or of certain items. If you just have large quantities and deal with shipping and handling of, say, batteries or something like that, even if you're not manufacturing them, could be a Schedule 2 activity now. That's kind of subjective, and then we'll see how that plays out, but they have added that on there. The other bit of an odd one or subjective one is medical labs. They've made it a Schedule 2 activity that any medical lab is now a yes answer on that SDS form. Some medical labs are pretty small and are pretty good at containing their small volumes of chemicals and things like that. So this is kind of a weird one, but we'll see if there's any clarification on that coming up. A couple of good removals or revisions is they removed retail paint stores from Schedule 2, which is great. Provides some relief, as well as above ground storage tanks or ASTs with secondary containment. So that includes a double walled tank or something that's in a concrete bunker type scenario, which is pretty popular. Sawmills has also been removed from the list. So when do you go ahead and submit one of these SDSs? When do you have to do this? What's triggering you? So any sort of municipal approval requiring significant disturbance to the subsurface. So they define that as greater than 1 meter. So the two big ones are development permits and building permits. So if you apply for one of those, the municipality will ask you to fill out an SDS form. The exceptions to those municipal applications are development variance permit, demo permit, utility upgrades, or any sort of fencing and signage work. You won't be asked to submit an SDS, which is great. You can just get your permits and go ahead with your work as you were hoping to. The other triggers, so this is the big one that they added in, is ceasing operations. So they define ceasing operations as stopping work for 1 year or more. And that requires you to submit an SDS to the ministry. And there's actually a trigger to investigate the site as well and show that there either is or isn't contamination. So there's some deadlines and all that kind of stuff involved with this that Keith will touch on a little later in the presentation, but that was a pretty big addition, the ceasing operations. You can't just sit on a property after your Schedule 2 activity ceases operations. Any sort of bankruptcy route, so bankruptcy, insolvency, foreclosure, Creditors Agreement Act, you'll be asked to submit an SDS. I mean, if you've gone bankrupt, you probably won't be asked to do investigations because you won't be able to, but they want to at least know what's there and what they're dealing with if it comes to them in the future. And lastly, the trigger that will affect a handful of people is the property transaction one. And there's no trigger to investigate the site at that point in time. They just want you to be disclosing to a potential buyer if there is a Schedule 2 activity or has been historically on the site. So you're only required to submit SDS to a purchaser if you have had a Schedule 2 activity on your site historically or currently. So I've talked now a little bit about what this new SDS form is, when you got to fill it out and how to fill it out a little bit, what a Schedule 2 activity is. So Keith will now elaborate on what happens next if you do have a Schedule 2 activity on the site, what the next steps are for you and what your options are.
Awesome, thanks, Paul. So yeah, we've covered a little bit about the SDS and what it is. So when you go to submit these SDS for a development permit or a building permit, it will actually be frozen at the municipality until some site investigations can be completed. The site investigations would start with the stage 1, which is kind of reviewing the current and historical information for the site and evaluating if there's any areas of potential environmental concern. If there are, then you would go towards the stage 2, which would be recommended to collect soil, groundwater samples to determine whether contamination is present or not. The next step in the process is if there is contamination, likely a detailed site investigation would be recommended, which basically quantifies how widespread and deep the contamination is. And then once the contamination extent is known, the site can then be remediated. There are many possible remediation options available, from excavation to in-ground injections, or to doing nothing and leaving it in ground to be risk assessed. That said, the different options should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis and determine which one is more effective for the particular project. So, depending on the findings of the initial investigation, there are two potential scenarios. Either the site will be clean or the site will be contaminated. If the site investigations conclude the site is clean, you would likely be applying for what's called as a determination. This is basically a document provided by the ministry outlining the site that has been investigated to provincial standards and it doesn't have any contamination. And so once you have obtained a determination, the permits are then unfrozen at the municipality, and you can commence with your planned development or building permit or whatever you had scheduled for the property. On the other hand, if the investigations conclude the site is contaminated, you will likely need to determine how widespread and deep the contamination is before you can get one of these three ministry documents. They include a freeze release, an approval in principle, or a certificate of compliance. Freeze release is a document which basically allows the permit to be approved if the remediation is going to be completed in conjunction with the development. So if you have some soil contamination on site, but you're planning to excavate the site for an underground parking lot, let's say, a freeze release allows you to complete that soil remediation during excavation for the underground parking. The approval in principle is somewhat similar to a release, but is generally used for more complex sites or when the redevelopment timelines are longer or uncertain. The approval in principle would unfreeze any permits and allows you up to 5 years to complete the remediation. And finally, you could go complete the whole process and obtain a certificate of compliance. This basically certifies that the site has been investigated and remediated to provincial standards. So how does this process work in practice? So this flowchart kind of summarizes how the process works. So first, the municipality receives a permit application for a commercial or industrial property, at which point the new site disclosure statement form would get submitted to the municipality, which outlines whether a Schedule 2 activity has occurred on the property or not. So if not, then no restrictions would apply to the permits and they would be approved. If there is a Schedule 2 activity, then you need to look at if there are any exemptions apply. Paul touched on some of these exemptions earlier. These include whether the disturbance is going to be greater than a meter, or if the site already has one of the 4 documents required to unfreeze a permit. That said, if no exemptions apply, then the SDS gets submitted to the ministry and you're automatically triggered into a site investigation. At this point, the permits will be frozen at the municipality until the owner can obtain one of the 4 documents outlined here. Just to quickly summarize again, the certificate of compliance confirms the site's been remediated. The approval in principle allows the site to be remediated within 5 years. If the site is clean, again, you would be applying for a determination that the site is not contaminated, or a release which allows you to do the remediation in conjunction with any sort of redevelopment activities. So once one of these products can be obtained, then no restrictions apply to your permits and you can proceed with the work. So a couple additional items that are included in these amendments. So firstly, municipalities can no longer opt out of this process. Under the previous regulations, the local municipalities that were opted out included Langford, Sauk, and Sydney, which basically meant they did not need provincial approval to approve these permits. On the other hand, now these permits will be frozen unless one of the 4 ministry products are obtained. There are also changes to the criminal code. We kind of envision this as more of a scare tactic than anything, since you are unlikely to be charged $75,000 per day if you honestly did not know about the changes in the rules or regulations. Although if you are willingly refusing to act in accordance with the regulations, these fines are at the ministry's disposal. And again, vendors of properties with Schedule 2 activities must provide purchasers with an SDS at least 30 days before possession. And as Paul mentioned, this is strictly for disclosure purposes and will not trigger any site investigations. And finally, when a Schedule 2 operation stops at a property, the property owner is required to submit an SDS within 6 months. So if you have an automotive repair and you stop business, you have 6 months to submit an SDS to the ministry. You then have 1 year to conduct investigations and notify the ministry as to whether there's contamination on site or not. So that was a lot of information, and this whole process is new for some of you. So I just wanted to review some of the key points and their impacts. So development in previously opted out municipalities, including Langford, Sydney, and Sooke, they may take longer and may cost more now because they need to adhere to these provincial site investigation requirements. In past, you would submit your development permit or building permit and they would not be held up at the municipality. Now these will be held up there. So just plan for some time to complete site investigations to allow one of the 4 documents to be obtained. And then for properties with Schedule 2 activities, as I mentioned, they cannot approve development and building permits without the previous ministry approval. And since decommissioning and ceasing operations now triggers a site investigation for Schedule 2 properties, it is important that owners of these properties allocate appropriate time and funds to complete these site investigations as part of their divestment strategy. Previously, you could cease operations and wait until you had a buyer to incentivize you to complete these site investigations. Now the ministry is putting somewhat of a clock on you that you have a year to complete these site investigations. So it's important to have the funds and time available to do that. And yeah, finally, these changes are complicated. We're wrapping our heads around these things too. It's new to us, and every property is different. So if you have any concerns, we recommend that you reach out and explore what the options are or when you need to submit one of these things. We're happy to discuss any particular situation with you. No obligation. Our biggest focus is ensuring that stakeholders are educated so that you can efficiently navigate these requirements. So with that, that concludes the presentation, and we are happy to take any questions. Thanks for attending today, and this is our contact information. You can reach out to either Paul or myself at the email or phone number there, and we've also included a link to the provincial government's website on these changes to site identifications. We can send a copy of these slides out to the participants if they like. Otherwise, yeah, we can get to the Q&A here.